Okay, we are recording.
All right. Thank you, Betty, for that introduction. Good afternoon and welcome to today's training, Achieving Community Integration. I'm Kathy Anderson from Public Consulting Group, and I'm joined by Amanda Alvey and Jamie Cohen, also from PCG. I'm going to start off today, and then Amanda will pick up the second section and we'll trade off during this presentation. We're going to talk about how person-centered planning and practices can assist you when working with people you support to achieve community integration. Next slide, please. On today's agenda, we are going to first cover foundational beliefs of person-centeredness. Next, we will talk about an overview of staff role in person-centered thinking and planning. Third, we will talk about balancing important to and important for. Then we will talk about embedding person-centered practices in the day-to-day work. And then finally, we'll talk about modifications to person-centered plans. Next slide, please. First up here, we're going to talk about the foundations of person-centered planning. The components of this slide are the foundational beliefs of person-centeredness, and it's really important that these are reviewed with everyone that works with people and are part of the person-centered organization. So the first one is that there are essential questions that all person-centered approaches begin with, such as who is this person, who is the person that we're working with, who are we supporting, and what is important to him or her. Second, person-centeredness aims to change common patterns of community life, moving beyond community involvement to real community engagement and integration, including natural supports and assisting the individual to achieve personal goals and live the life they want. This is the aspect of being a part of the community rather than just being in the community. Number three, person-centeredness fundamentally challenges practices that separate people in segregated settings and instead supports the person to be as independent as possible and to have the skills to advocate for themselves. Number four, true person-centered practices reflect genuine respect for the dignity, strength, and individuality of the person. And number five, supporting individuals in defining and pursuing a desirable future takes clarity, courage, and commitment. This is really hard work, and we don't mean to minimize the work or the effort that it takes to truly be person-centered, but it is very important. And remember, it's essential to people living the life that they want within their communities. Next slide, please. This next section talks about staff roles in person-centered agencies. And we're talking about the role of staff at all levels within a person-centered system. This includes the directors, the managers, the direct support professionals, your office staff, whether that is your receptionist or your bookkeeper who's paying bills, or your van drivers or people who are providing transportation to make sure that people get from one place to another. It's really important that they understand that their role is to promote understanding, respect, dignity, and positive images of the individuals that they support. Staff should support connections that lead to full community integration. Staff should also ensure that supports are available to the person based on the person's desired outcomes and the individual's valued experiences. This is to the extent possible that there should be provided through natural supports. And we're not talking about just pushing things off to people within the community or the person's family network, but as a full life or a complete life, we know that we all have natural supports and extended supports within our environment that are not just paid support. Staff should facilitate advocacy and discovery for individuals as they achieve their desired future. One of the things we talk about here often is the person's desired future, living the life that they want, and also to the extent that the person desires. And it's important to remember that this is going to vary from person to person, but an essential role of quality person-centered planning is getting to know the person and working with them so that you can express or they can express to you, whether it's verbally or through their gestures or facial expressions, how they want to live their lives and what things are important to them. It is very important for staff to get to know people so that whether or not a person has verbal communication skills, they can, in fact, communicate and are, in fact, always communicating to staff both their pleasure and their displeasure with various activities and events going on. We'll go to the next slide. Important to and important for are connected. This is a process you should be familiar with given your training in person-centered practices. I know that in Mississippi you do a lot of training, so I don't imagine this is a new concept, but we want to reinforce the key components of important to and important for. And it's important to look at how these two concepts influence each other. No one does anything that's important for them willingly unless a piece of it is important to them. And I think that we can all call up examples from our personal life. Many of us know that it's important to eat a healthy, balanced diet, not only because we're able to engage in more physical activity, that we don't get sick, but many of us also enjoy the pleasure of chocolate or desserts or doing something that may not be the healthiest activity for us. So we have to relate this to our own lives and say, if I am going to maintain a healthy weight, why is it not only important for me, but it's important to me? Perhaps my clothes fit better and I like clothes, so that's my motivation. The balance between important to and important for is dynamic, and it involves trade-offs. And we really need to think about how we find that balance. We all make trade-offs between the many different things that are important to us. We talked about, for example, here, some people may love living in a particular place, and they're willing to make the trade-off when living there means a longer commute to a job that they love, or it may mean that it costs more and it takes a larger portion of their budget than might be advisable, but it would be something that they take great pleasure in their home environment, and so they're willing to make that sacrifice. We also make trade-offs between what is important to us and what's important for us. These trade-offs can be temporary or long-term. For some fun time with friends, which is important to a person, having a clean house may be part of being valued by those same friends. House cleaning occasionally comes before having fun with friends. So you can see the trade-off there. I want my friends to come over. They will be uncomfortable if my house is messy or dirty, if I have crumbs on my counter or something like that. I want to be respectful toward them. So I'm going to clean my house, which is going to maybe take away from some of my independent leisure time. But on the other hand, my friends are going to come over and we're going to engage and have a very nice time together. For another person, expressing personal opinions and saying what's on their mind may be very important to them, but not cussing in front of his neighbors may be important for him. What we mean by this example is that perhaps somebody gets very animated when expressing their opinions, and they may use language that would be offensive to someone who's listening to them. And so if they want the person to continue listening to them and to be part of their circle of support, they might need to modify their language. So you can see how these trade-offs can be balanced. You can speak the way you want when you are either alone or with others who are accepting of that language. But if you know it makes someone uncomfortable, but you want to establish a relationship with them, you're going to modify your language and your approach. So these are just a couple of examples of how you find the balance. So I think we can move to the next slide. This is an important slide. Just a second here while I get to my right page. Moving from a service life to a community life. This is the required minimum standard for people is a service life. This is where issues of health and safety are adequately addressed. This is where the presence of what is important to a person depends on who supports you and how much they care about you. It's often random and unpredictable. Think about how many of you have worked with someone that you really cared about. You knew what made that person really happy, and you made those things happen. But eventually you may have moved on with your career or moved to a different house, and you were no longer in that person. So then in that person's life, and then new people came in, and they may not have known the person as well. So does it take some time to go beyond a service life? Yes, it certainly does. You know, a service life is often where everyone starts because you're just getting to know one another. But if you don't really have the balance there because you're addressing what's important for the person, that's based on assessed needs and a very limited knowledge of the person, but you don't really start to introduce what's important to the person until you start moving along this continuum to what is a good paid life, and that's where important too is present. A good paid life is not a bad place to be, and it's where probably about 80% of the people that are supported by many agencies are, and that usually means that people are healthy and safe. But if we look closely at this, it means that there may be other people who are involved in their who are not involved in their life, excuse me. This means that they may not have family who are engaged in their life. They may not have people from the community who are engaged in their life. They only have people such as staff from either their day setting or their home setting that are involved with their life. Sometimes this can include family if there are people being family members who are paid support, but it really means that there are relatively few connections for the person with their community. What we'd like to see is that people are moving along this continuum to a focus on connecting and building relationships and using natural supports or community supports, if you will, and that's where you get to living a community life. A community life has been the goal for a long time in home and community-based services, and as somebody who's been involved in these services for the majority of her adult life, I would say that we have not done an excellent job at this. We are continually evolving and hopefully moving toward doing a better job of supporting people to have a community life, but it is something where we have to step outside of ourselves or get out of our own way as paid professionals and really start focusing on how a person really becomes part of their community. I think that there's an example that we often use is the Mother Duck tour of a Target store where you see a van pulls up and a group of people with disabilities followed by their staff wander through the stores, you know, up and down the aisles. People are picking up things that they want. But because people are moving in a group, they're often not approached by either the clerks in the store or other people in the store the way you or I might be when we're there more independently and moving more independently through the aisles of the store. So you have to think, again, that when you have the Mother Duck tour of a grocery store, a Target, a Walmart, whatever kind of stores in your community, that's really being present in the community but not participation in the community, and it really isn't part of community life. So I think this would be an important discussion for you to have with the staff that you work with and among yourself, and really think about how you might walk through this and use some examples from what is happening in a day program or what's happening in a residential setting, and see how this exercise could help you dissect those experiences and think about how you could, in fact, move to support people to a community life. I think that's the end of the section that I'm going to be presenting this morning, so I'm going to be handing it off to Amanda.
All right, thanks, Kathy. I'm going to take a pause here for a second and check with Jamie and see if there are any questions that come through the chat box.
I don't see any questions. Someone reported it was a little bit difficult to hear Kathy at times, but I think we switched over it. The sound issue should not be an issue anymore.
All right, thank you. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about person-centered planning and just kind of what that looks like from a day-to-day operational standpoint. Obviously, Kathy went over the person-centered planning concepts and the focus of, what's important to an individual and important for them. But the goal here is to understand that person-centered planning is really it's more than a document that's done once a year and updated as required. The goal for an individual's day-to-day life is to really focus on developing a meaningful plan that will be the foundation and the guiding document in working with an individual. That's just an important part of the process, and it should be ongoing. It shouldn't look at as just, as I mentioned, an annual task. If you are an agency, and I know many of you in Mississippi have already received training on person-centered planning, and if you've implemented some of these strategies, it doesn't mean that you still can't kind of take a step back and really look at what you've done so far. What's working, evaluate what's working, what hasn't worked, what should you be doing instead, and just thinking through some of these questions. Even if you have a setting that's doing generally well or you think you're doing generally well about facilitating individual access to the community, maybe take a step back from that and really look at maybe there are other strategies where you can improve that access even further. Obviously, there are always budgetary constraints to that, but there can be some differences in staffing models or the way activities are structured that can help assist with even better access to the community. And this really is, while it's an essential part of the home and community-based services setting final rule, it's really something that I know would be a goal for all of your sites as well, as just focusing on more community integration wherever possible, looking for some of those relationships and building upon what's already existing within the community. Every community has its own resources that are already there, so that's really the best place to start. Looking at some of those neighboring businesses, other homes in the area that maybe you can help facilitate. Maybe there are other community transportation options outside of just your standard public transportation that can help facilitate some of that access. Providers may join a local community board like the Chamber of Commerce. That's also going to help increase some of those relationships with existing businesses. Other communities and states have developed community-based advisory groups that also helps facilitate some of those connections. So, if an individual really wants to volunteer somewhere, you can use those groups and those existing resources to think through other social and recreational activities that individuals may want to participate in. A few examples we added here were the local library, a farmer's market, a senior center, school district, local college or university. All of those are great tools for starting some of those conversations about how you can work with them. And it doesn't always just have to focus on a staffing model. Obviously, there are ways that, maybe you're going to have to rethink some of your staffing that doesn't involve just hiring more staff, but if you start using or looking to use some of the existing community resources that you already have, that can also reduce some of those budgetary constraints of facilitating more community access. The other thing here is a lot of these, with engaging in the local community, you want to ensure that you're not just focusing on what works for the setting, but making sure the individual family feels included in part of that process. If you have community-based advisory groups, you want to make sure that you're ensuring or encouraging family participation as well. The next slide just goes over a little bit more about how you can develop some of those community connections. Let's say an individual explains that they like to garden. If you have a local farmers market or know of local resources that could help facilitate that, the individual, they may be able to work directly with that individual and allow them to volunteer or work with them at the local farmers market. They could help getting boxes together or even serving as a cashier for them at the farmers market. Libraries are always good resources for both activities that individuals might want to participate in, but also volunteer activities too. So if you have an individual that likes to read, they may also be interested in volunteering at the local library. They can help reshelf books or assist in any way there. I know there are a lot of examples throughout a lot of the settings that we went to in Mississippi where individuals really enjoy attending church. That's something that is very important to them. We saw that pretty consistently. So churches are a great way to help facilitate some increased community integration. They always have their own activities and options for individuals to volunteer. Maybe they can help with services or planning some of the coffee hours or other activities that the churches may host. The best way to really capture all of this information, finding out what an individual is interested in, what are their needs, really what are those important things in their day that they want to focus on and really build on, that's done through the person-centered planning process. Making sure that you're asking these questions of individuals, what do they want to participate in, what activities are they interested in, asking some of the background questions if your staff aren't already familiar with an individual's life prior to coming to the setting. What job did they have? Maybe they were a teacher. There's always a local business or resource that you can help engage them in. What hobbies do they want to participate in? All of those things that are already there in your communities, it's just making those connections. Kathy's going to cover some of the person-centered planning tools later on, but those are that's the best way to start. Not every tool that we go over or not every tool that you can access is going to work for every single individual that you serve, but there are a variety of options out there that are going to work across various disabilities and demographics. Those tools are going to help facilitate those conversations and start really getting at the root of what an individual is interested in and what they want their day-to-day life to look like. Next slide, please. From a staffing perspective, I know that's one of the most common areas where we get questions and what is perceived to be one of the biggest barriers of helping facilitate increased access to the broader community. Staffing can be very limited. I know, at least for you all, there are minimum staffing levels that have to be maintained, but one way to help increase that access is to start looking at your staffing patterns. What are your staffing models? How many staff are available at any given time? And even and looking at that number in comparison to how they're utilized during those hours that they work. What do your shifts look like? Are there ways to accommodate trips across various shifts? Maybe you pull staff from one shift to the other if they're not being fully utilized during some of the other shifts. Again, you have to maintain what those staffing levels are, but really looking at not just how many staff you have, but how they're being utilized. The other thing that you want to look at when you're evaluating your staffing patterns is what the required level of support is for the individuals. Even if you are maintaining your staffing levels, you still want to look at whether maybe you have too many staff, and when you're assessing that across the individuals that you support, that level of support is really going to help you evaluate how you can offer more individual or group activities across the board. For example, during the week, there may be less requests for individuals to go out into the community if they're already participating in work or day activities. So maybe you could alter some of your staff during the week in the evenings and add those staff to another weekend shift that would allow individuals to get out into the community during those hours. Another option is to stagger those staff start and end times and purposely have some of that overlap during some of the higher times where you know that you're going to have a greater number of individuals that are going to want to access the community either individually or in a group, you know, especially if you have some community activities coming up that were planned as a group and you have a larger group that is choosing to attend. The other thing to look at, I know CMS just released some guidance around heightened scrutiny specifically, but there are some best practices that they outlined in that document that can address some of the staffing patterns and allow you to start thinking through that process a little bit more and how you can maybe shift or reallocate staff once you've assessed kind of what your individual level of support or required level of support would be. Next slide, please. Again, this is also kind of highlight and connect that sometimes staffing really isn't the answer to increasing that access to the community and having additional options for activities. Sometimes your staff or your site only needs to be the one that facilitates those connections. And once you have those connections and building upon the existing community resources, you know, it may not just be contingent upon a staffing model or having increased access to transportation. There's a few examples here that we've outlined. Say you have an individual, and we've heard this example pretty consistently, which is why we use it. You know, you have an individual that lives in a group home and they want to attend a specific church. They are able to go with the group every Sunday, but there's group meetings during the week, or they want to go to a Wednesday service. That the site can't always facilitate that transportation. So, but what the site can do is make a connection, you know, contact the minister, contact maybe some of the families that you know that attend that service and see if they can't pick them up for the other services. And you're not only helping facilitate that, but you're helping increase that individual's connections to other group members. And connecting with other church members, maybe they eventually become a volunteer and assist with ushering the services as well. We did see examples of this when we conducted our site assessments. We saw some pretty good examples of this kind of facilitation in various sites across the state. And I know that's, you know, churches and, again, those local organizations are a really good group to start making those connections with. Next slide, please. I know this has been touched on a little bit, but again, I know one of the other bigger barriers or perceived barriers for improving integration into the community is transportation. Obviously, in certain areas of the state, there's going to be limited access to public transportation, but one thing the site that can do is start looking at those resources, you know, really evaluating what's available. And if it's available, is it currently being utilized? If not, you know, speak to the individuals that you're serving in your setting and find out why. Maybe they don't know how to access transportation schedules. They don't know how to contact the bus lines to get that information, you know. So again, you don't really have to, even if your site doesn't provide transportation, looking at what those existing resources may be. In the example of an individual attending church services, maybe the church has a van where they pick up groups of individuals and transport them to and from service. Maybe there's other community organizations that have community transport vans that you can contact them and see if there aren't ways that you can partner with them and use them for transportation services as well. Ride shares are common. I know Uber, Lyft, sometimes, you know, again, facilitating that connection and working with individuals and educating them on all of their options and how to access those options. Any questions come through, Jamie?
Nope, I have not seen any.
All right. We'll move on to modifying person-centered plans. As I know you all are very well aware at this point, the HCBS settings rule requires person-centered plans and lays out very specific criteria for modifications to an individual's person-centered plan. So we're going to start walking through what each of those requirements look like. For provider-owned and controlled settings in particular, there were some of those additional criteria in the HCBS rule that settings had to follow. For example, freedom and support to control one's own schedule and activities, access to food and visitors at any time, privacy, lockable doors, with only appropriate staff having keys, choices in roommates, choices in housemates. Those were all of those additional requirements that were outlined to be documented in a person-centered plan, and especially if there were any sort of modification to those criteria. The same thing works with, access to the community. If a setting is restricting an individual's access to the community, there needed to be a clear outline in their person-centered plan as to why there were any restrictions on that access. And so the next couple of slides, we're going to walk through what some of that documentation should look like. It applies across any of these standards, but we're going to focus primarily on access to the broader community. Next slide, please. So all of these criteria, again, were laid out in the HCBS final rule, and really the rule to live by with any of these criteria is that there cannot be blanket restrictions across the board. So if you serve one individual in your setting that is at risk of wandering behavior and you have something documented in their person-centered plan that says they cannot access the community independently, you can't have that same policy across the board and say, well, we serve one individual that has this documented restriction, so we're going to make everybody go out in groups because that's what our staffing can accommodate. Any modification has to be assessed and supported by an individual's assessed need. You have to make sure that you include that justification in their person-centered plan. And it's not just about documenting, let's say it's a specific medical diagnosis or the example of the wandering behavior, and that's, the individual has been properly assessed, and that's why that's the justification that you use in the person-centered plan for that modification. It should also include what else has been done to help educate the individual or work with them on whatever behavior they're exhibiting, or positive interventions, what supports have been used prior to actually implementing that restriction. Those methods should be less intrusive of meeting the need that were tried and did not work. All of that should be clearly outlined in their person-centered plan. Make sure you spend time in the discussion with the individuals about this. It's definitely a harder concept, and not always, each one of these, all of this information isn't always discussed with the individual and clearly outlined in their person-centered plan. But this is really important to make sure that you're not just jumping from, okay, here's their need and here's their restriction. There should be corresponding information and documentation in their plan that shows there were steps prior to whatever your documented restriction is for that individual. Next slide, please. Just furthering that information, once a modification has been made to an individual's person-centered plan, there should be an ongoing regular collection and review of that restriction to make sure that it's still effective. Once that restriction's in place, it's not an end of the process. That really should just be continued to be addressed. Establishing time limits, making sure that there are periodic reviews to determine whether that modification or restriction is still appropriate. Maybe it should only be a short-term restriction. Maybe there are other strategies that you learn that work for that individual later on. So again, that's why it's important to continue to review that restriction or modification and make sure the appropriateness is maintained. The other reason it's important to make sure you're discussing all of these modifications with the individual and really working through what some of those other interventions have been tried and maybe didn't work as effectively, is making sure that when you're getting their informed consent that you've discussed all of these items with them. You should not have any modification to a person-centered plan without that individual's informed consent. And then in general, again, just making sure that whatever intervention or supports are put in place or modifications are not causing any more harm or any harm at all to the individual that's receiving services. I'm going to pass it back over to Kathy to start the conversation on making these decisions.
Thanks, Amanda. So as Amanda said, she's drawn for you some of the connections to the HCBS settings rule and those requirements and achieving community integration. And what I really want to talk about now is how you help people make those connections. So I'll go over the bullets on this slide, and then we're going to, down the road here, go over some possible tools and approaches that you can use to assist your staff in getting to know people better and developing true person-centered plans, and that hopefully lead to true integration for each of the individuals that they're working with. So the first thing I think everyone knows about the discovery process, which really is a part of a compliant person-centered planning process, that's really about how you get to know the person and how you can then do better planning. So you want to make sure that you have an ongoing discovery process, not something that happens once. As we all know, we all change and develop over time, and so just because you may have done a good discovery process with the person when they entered services, that doesn't mean it's still valid, because they have changed over time and perhaps their preferences and desires have been modified by their life experiences. So it's an ongoing process. The same thing when we talk about creating a living plan for a person. Knowing that service plans are, of course, by requirement updated annually or developed annually and updated on a regular basis. But what about when something happens in a person's life that might be life-changing for them? Perhaps they have someone that they've been very close to and that person has passed on, or perhaps someone that they knew within the service system has been a housemate for years and years, and that person moved to another state. Those are things that could affect how a person's plan is going and what's going on in their life. So it's important to make sure that that plan really is reflective of what's going on in a person's life on a day-to-day basis, and not something that's a one and done set in cement. Also, as you make modifications about additional standards that Amanda talked about, and she talked about how that relates to making informed choices, when you're having those discussions with people about any kind of rules, if you're talking with them about these things on a one-to-one basis, it's an opportunity for a person to learn and discuss with you what they do understand, what they might like about that, what they might not like about it, and then it would lead to a better choice. So making sure that if you talk to people about having visitors, and perhaps there is, there's some preference within the house that visitors would not come unannounced, that they might call and check first to make sure the person that they want to visit is home. Talking to the person about how they feel about that. Is that something that's acceptable to them? Do they like surprises? Do they like it when people just drop in or not? also how they would feel if they were the person going to someone else's house. Would they make prior arrangements? There's a lot of opportunities for people to learn about things and how they might conduct themselves in the community or in someone else's home. That if there's just a blanket rule that's given to a person with no discussion, means that their choice on that might be limited, or their thoughts on that cannot be fully developed. And then the whole part about balancing what's important to a person and what's important for a person to promote informed choices of services and supports. That's moving, again, beyond just that health and safety to quality and meaningful lives. Doing, with the people that are being supported, not just for people being supported, that hinges on building skills and having them have experiences and make choices that will inform what their service planning will look like, and also ultimately what their integration in their community might, that will influence how that integration in the community will occur. So next slide, please. So here's an example of what is a one-page personal profile. And as you can see, there's some boxes on this. And it's, the first box is what people like and admire about. And you fill in the person's name, and then you can put a name, the picture of the person on there. You can write down things that are important to the person, and how to best support or serve the person. So what are their preferences? Do they have a preference for how they're addressed? Do they have a preference for male staff or female staff? And there's also then the box about a good match for characteristics needed to be present or absent. So what kinds of things are important to the person? Perhaps they like a calm environment, or maybe they like to have their favorite music playing in the background that makes them relax and feel more comfortable. I think that the thing that's important about this particular personal profile is it's something that's helpful to do on yourself as an experiment. And then you can also, I'm familiar with opportunities where we've done these in a group. So we have all of the staff come together and complete these and then share them with one another because you can build better working relationships. So I think that if people experience this document as something that relates to them, then when you're working with a person to complete their person-centered profile, it also has more meaning to it because you can say, oh, when I was doing this, I learned this, I realized it was important to me to say to people that this is something that if they want to, catch me in a good mood, this is how this is going to work. I think that it's also, if you have these person-centered profiles on file for the people that are being supported, it's something that new staff or substitute staff can take a look at. And they'll have a better understanding and some knowledge of the people that they're going to be supporting. So they have multiple purposes. I'll tell you just a quick little story. I used one of these sort of personal profiles of myself. I was going into a hospital to have some surgery. I knew that I may or may not be able to speak with staff once I was awakening from the surgery, those kinds of things. But there were certain things I wanted them to know about me that were important. And so I worked with my doctor, and this became a part of my chart. So they could know that these were some things that would be important to me. Like I would want to know that my family knew that I was okay. I would want to know that I'm kind of a private person. So if I was in a shared room, I might want to have the curtain drawn. Those sorts of things that are important to me as a person, the things that we shared with the hospital staff so that it could be a better experience for me. Once you know these things about a person, you can start to use them in all kinds of planning activities and as you're working with them. So Jamie, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. So this we say, how do we use interest to help people connect? And a practical person-centered approach is what we use. So we need to be aware that community integration will vary by person. It's not the same for each one of us. Some of us we may be extroverts and desire to be more involved with our community and more involved with people, but all of us are interdependent and still want to be out and not be hermits or isolated from people. We're going to explore on the next few slides some questions, how these questions can be answered. Excuse me. It's important to know that the discovery information can be used to aid in providing person-centered services for the person. We can help providers connect with the people they serve in a more person-centered way to help them meet their goals. So here's, on this slide, I'm just going to take a drink of water here so I don't cough again. Here are some tips for exploring connections. As I said, get to know the person first or get to know the person better. So you may want to spend some more time talking with the individuals. Encourage your staff to explore a person's interests with them, strike up conversations. I know not all people are verbal, but people, as we all do, communicate non-verbally. And so people can start to pick up on a tilt of the head, or when someone closes their eyes or turns away. What are they telling you? And you can only recognize what those signs mean if you know a person. And the only way you know a person is by spending time with them. You can also choose a particular preference or interest or hobby of the person. So maybe you are telling them about things that you're interested in and their interest perks up. You could talk with them about if they've ever had that opportunity to do that activity. Do they have any interest in it? Or if they could change that activity, how would they change it? So it's really, again, getting to shared experience and getting more knowledge and information to the person. You can also brainstorm all the ways that preferences or interests could be used to support or serve the person. And I think that it's important when you do the brainstorming to know that not everything has to be reasonable and achievable. You can dream a little when you brainstorm, and then when you bring it down to the actual planning, that's when you start saying, well, we had this kind of crazy idea, but how could we make this work for this person? And get creative. You can brainstorm, again, all the places that the hobby or the activity could be pursued. Could it be a job? Is it just a hobby? Is it just a topic that someone wants to learn about, or some way for them to do to pass time, something that they've done perhaps in the past and they want to revisit. Maybe once they revisit, they don't want to continue with it, but it's also interesting sometimes to follow up on some old hobbies or areas where a person may have had some interest. Again, talk about where and when in the constellation of supports and services. And that includes health services, that preferences or interests could be employed. So not only when you're meeting someone's health and safety needs, are there preferred ways to meet those that involve an interest or something that makes the person feel more comfortable? So again, just so it's not cookie cutter, I think that that's the important piece here. Also, if somebody wants to engage in a hobby that seems like it might be more of an individual hobby, for example, knitting or crocheting or doing needlework or those kinds of things, are there activities in the community where there's a group that gets together and perhaps they do some kind of knitting for an activity that they might then donate? I'm aware of a group that got together to knit little booties for babies in nurseries, in hospitals, or at daycare centers, and they were donated then. So not only were people sharing a common hobby and interest, but they were also giving back to the community within which they lived. You can develop an action plan for each idea that is identified. And that action plan can either be something that we're going to talk about action plans in more detail, so you know that there are some key questions you have to ask. But it doesn't always have to be written down, but it could be an agreement that you have that this is what we're going to do about this, because you need to make a commitment to actually act upon the information that you have. And then identify any levels of connectedness. Excuse me, that's not a word that rolls off my tongue. But looking to see if there are pieces throughout a person's life, a theme, something, a thread that runs through that makes these things connect and be more meaningful to them. Family is important to them. Perhaps they want to spend more time with an extended family of people where people know their mother or their father or their brothers or their sisters. It doesn't always have to be a straight line. It can be a dotted line of being connected. The next few slides are going to be an overview of an activity that staff can engage in as part of exploring how a person can make connections. We can't complete this activity as part of this webinar, but it's something that you or a group of your coworkers could do together. So the first step, as we talked about this, is getting to know the person or getting to know them better. So you talk about what's important to the person, and why is that important? And then talk about what you like and admire about a person. This is an interesting one because a lot of times people really think about, this is what I know that Kathy needs to work on. These are the things that Kathy needs to have in her life. But we don't think about it from the perspective of, you know, what I really like about her is she has a can-do attitude, or she's always willing to try something new, or I really admire that she makes an effort to say good morning to every person when she sees them. That's something that's really important to her, to make that connection. So you really need to flip, sort of just looking not only at needs of a person, but what is a person bringing to the game? There definitely are things to like about everyone that you know, and things that you might admire about that person, and then build upon those. And then finally, what are the supports and services that are needed, the old important for? So how do we marry all of these things? You start with what's important to the person, what you like and admire about them, and how you meet some of those things that are important for are much more natural and less deficit focused, if you will. Do you want to go on to the next slide, please? Jamie, can you move the slide? Okay, so discovering a person's interest, talk to somebody who knows the person best. What interests are they aware of? Are there favorite books or subjects or pictures that capture the person's interest more than others? Some of these are observational skills that you would want your staff to develop. So again, when they're engaging with people, noticing what kinds of things catches a person's eye when they're out in the community, when they're watching a television show, maybe going for a walk around the neighborhood. Does somebody always comment on all of the flowers? Oh, does that mean that they might be interested in growing flowers or arranging flowers? Those sorts of things. Also, what kind of things does the person look forward to? Do people have an activity or an event that they keep bringing up? And then are there things that you could do to help them be prepared for that, or have opportunities that are similar to that on a more frequent basis that might be of interest for them? And then, as I mentioned earlier, are there particular things from the past that a person talks a lot about? I think one of the things, sometimes people have an interest in a place where they used to live. And so exploring with them, what was it about that place that you liked so much? Was it the people? Was it the way the home was furnished? What were the activities that you got to be engaged in? Those are really important to talk to people about those interests and why that catches their attention. So I think think about things such as music, cooking. Is there a railroad? Was there a railroad that went by their house, and so that's something that they like. NASCAR, or other kinds of car races. Is it a football, baseball, hockey, any sport at all that people are really interested in? Sometimes it's fishing or dancing, gardening, flowers. As I use the example of walking around the neighborhood, I mean, spring and summer are wonderful times for those. Perhaps it's, if you're living in a more rural area, it's when the farmers are planting and people's experience with that. Have they ever had a garden? Did they grow up on a farm? Does their family live on a farm now? What are their interests around that whole activity? On other opportunities are, having people attend the theater, go to plays or other performances. Do people have an interest in history? If you live in a city and you see a lot of airplanes coming and going and landing, have people, talking to people about their interest, even just visiting an airport. Most airports have museums that go through some history of aviation, and taking people there so that as an opportunity to experience something that they may not have had that experience doing. Again, as we talked about, I think in the first one of the other training sessions that we did, people don't know what they don't know. So it's an opportunity for staff to, discovery is an opportunity to give people exposure to other interests and ideas about things that they might work. And then there's the typical things of artwork, painting, ceramics, and other crafts. Also animals, whether those be cats, dogs, or farm animals. I know I think this was in Mississippi, we saw there was a couple of ladies that we were able to meet that really liked jewelry, and they did jewelry making at home, and they were looking at that leading to a small business for them to be selling the jewelry, or at least consigning jewelry in other locations. And then we've also experienced where there were some opportunities for people to, agreed upon sharing of doing hairdos or nails and that kind of thing as a group activity, as well as being able to go in the community and experiencing those. One more slide, and then I'm going to stop and pause for questions. So, these are, again, just a reiteration of helping people develop their interests. Does an interest, spur a connection to an activity or to a connection to a group, making sure that that a person, when you consider what's important to and important for the person, which ideas should you pursue? How do you prioritize those? And how do you make sure that it's something that's achievable, not just a pie-in-the-sky dream, which we would all give up on, but making sure that there's some kind of a connection that can be made for the person. And then as you decide how the idea can best be selected and pursued, making sure that you brainstorm those options and then narrow that down to a real list of things for people to pursue. And the final step, that action step, is putting the ideas into motion and committing to doing something so that it means it will really happen for the person. Because if we don't make that commitment of identifying who's going to do what, when, and what is the goal, then nothing really ever comes of it. And so it's really important to know that while you spend all of that time understanding what a person's interests are, determining how you could pursue them, that then you actually have an action plan of how you're going to implement that and carry it forward. Are there any questions at this point, Jamie?
I have not seen any questions in the chat box, so a reminder again to everyone, if you have any questions or comments, please send them through and we will address them as we go.
Okay, we'll go to the next slide while people are thinking about questions or maybe typing some questions. Oops. I think I already talked about this slide. Can we go one more forward? This is the action plan. So here's where you could actually use this tool with staff. You could, and then it might become a more natural process for people, but you put the outcome that you desire. So what is the activity or the connection that is going to be pursued, and who's going to be responsible for seeing that happens? And then the second column will do what? What will the person do to make sure that this connection for the individual happens? And then by when? You need to timeline it so that you can make sure that you can be held accountable for it. And then this last question on here is especially important when you talk about how will we know it has been accomplished. It's really important to define what is being done or what's going to happen so that you know that it happened without that there's not, again, the accountability. Because if you wait to evaluate what happened afterwards, you're just going to be stating the obvious. The person didn't go or they went, but they did not enjoy the activity. But what you're hoping to accomplish is usually more aspirational and positive. It's about the person making the connection within the community to either start to participate in a hobby or some kind of an event. And so you can understand whether or not they attended the event, and then also you would evaluate what happened at the event, and is it something that the person would like to pursue again? And then there becomes another action plan for the next time and the next time. And so it's important that you answer all of these questions. Are there any questions at this point, Jamie?
Nope.
Okay. Next slide is on accountability. And this is the what happens after we try it. The old how will you know if it worked? And there's a couple of tools that you can use. I think that people may be familiar with learning logs, which is something where you can write down how the process worked and what you learned from the activity. And then also using the 4+1 questions to discuss with the team about what worked, what made sense, is there an upside, and what didn't work and didn't make sense, and what's the downside of this. It's a critical analysis, not for punishing people or for but instead for improving practice. You know, sometimes if you don't try, you don't know that it's going to be a success. You also don't know that it's going to be a failure. That's always an option. Like failure is always an option, right? It might not work out, but it also could not work out, but you could learn something really critical about how it was in fact implemented that could have made all the difference if you're able to do this critical analysis. I think it's important for you to know and for your staff to know that not everything is going to be successful, but you have to try to know, you have to try and make the effort to know if that's the case. And it's the only way you can kind of do a process of elimination with people about what they may or may not like if they have very limited choices that they've shared with you. If you are suggesting them to try something new, it could be a raving success, and it could also be a terrible failure. But they learned, and it would be important to debrief with them about what they learned about it, because as you dig through that and pick through that process and what happened, you'll probably get some little gems of things that, in order for this to be successful the next time, here's what we need to make sure that the person is more well prepared, that the person's expectations are reasonably set, those kinds of things. So it's just important to really look at it. If you go to the next slide, this is where we lay out the 4+1 questions. This is how you evaluate them. And so again, what did you try? What was the person's experience? What did you learn from that? Did the staff learn something? Did the person learn something from that experience? Maybe they liked the idea, but they really didn't. There were too many people there, and so it was something that was intimidating to them. So perhaps the next time it needs to start on a smaller scale, maybe only 1 or 2 other people, not a group of 5 to 10 people. What are you pleased about? So again, not only asking this with staff, but talking with the person about, well, given this experience, was there something that made you happy about it, something that made you feel good, something you'd like to try again? And then what are you concerned about? How could we change things so that it feels better next time, that you have a better time? And then always you can ask the 5th question, which we put here, is what will we try next? What's the next opportunity? Okay, so this wasn't this wasn't a home run success, but is there something similar to this that we could do? Not just scrap the whole thing, or should we try it one more time, give it a second try, and see if we make some of the adjustments about what you told us didn't work for you, and build upon the things that really made it work and made it successful for you. So let's give it another try and see, and knowing that you'll come back and evaluate it again, and letting the person know they're not stuck with this as their connection or their activity. It is an opportunity. I think that we could all relate to the many, many times we've tried something, and the first time it wasn't exactly what we thought it would be, but there was enough of an interest in us that it sparked us to go back. Any questions on that?
It was not a question, but we did receive a comment from someone writing in saying the person-centered tool Perfect Week with a learning log for discovery is what we use to accomplish this. I think they wrote that in right before you started talking about that. So.
Okay, that's great. So you all are familiar with these tools, and I think that that's great that you're doing the learning log. And the Perfect Week, I think that's a really great tool also, so that you can really know what are the things that are important and need to be in place to support a person having a good week or even a good day. Sometimes it's good to start with just a day rather than the whole week. On this slide, here's just another way to look at how you're evaluating what's working and making sense and what's not working and not making sense. And as you can see from the graph here, you can have this divided into sections where it's the person's perspective and the staff's perspective. And then you can look at where there are disagreements and how you use that information to build on things that need to change. It's a great opportunity to do, and I think this is something that often doesn't happen, is this reflection on where you're sharing both perspectives of the person and the staff, and then figuring out how does that mean that things can change so that the person, in fact, is feeling that it is successful. It's not, the staff may think it was a catastrophic failure, but the person's like, no, honestly, it wasn't that bad for me. And here are some things I would like to change about it. and it helps the staff person understand what's important to the person also, because something that we may have thought was not clear or important is something that really worked for them. And if you don't sit down and talk with them about it, you're not going to really be able to identify those things. It's important, that this is a good way to help people create meaningful goals and plans, and not just stupid goals, or when I say stupid goals, I mean goals that are repetitive, that don't seem to lead anywhere, the same goals year after year, but making sure that they are important to the person and are meaningful and assist them with integration. And it also, the disagreements that show up are often really important to talk through them, because that improves working relationships and, again, our understanding of one another. Let's see. And so this is just another way to say, you can use this tool to organize your perspectives about a specific issue or get a snapshot description of now. And so there's some examples there, again, about the questions that you can ask the individual or their family, so that you can better understand how to make changes or how to build upon successes.
Kathy?
Yes?
This is Betty. Excuse me, but when you look down or look away, it's difficult to hear you.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was turning my head. Sorry about that. So as I said, I'll just repeat that this is just another view of how to organize the information that you can gather when you're doing an assessment on whether or not some of the connections have worked. And it gives you some questions to ask for the person that's being supported, to talk with their family and their friends, and also to talk with their staff people about that. And so you can then develop a plan about how the next time you would either build upon those areas or what you would improve upon. Hopefully that was better. Any questions at this point?
No other questions.
I think I'm going to turn it back to Amanda at this point.
Thanks, Kathy. Just to kind of wrap up with all of this information, obviously you all are very familiar with person-centered planning, and I'm sure when you talk to your direct service staff, a lot of these conversations are really already occurring. It's really about formalizing it through the person-centered planning process and looking for other ways that you can facilitate and strengthen what those local connections are. Really getting at the root of what an individual's likes and dislikes are, and working and having ongoing conversations with them about what their goals and vision for a good life, and understanding that that is going to look different for each person that is receiving services in your setting. And we talked through a lot of this, but again, just kind of reiterating, especially with increasing access and better integration within the broader community. Some of that additional information that's helpful as part of this process is really looking at their needs and that balance of what's important to them other than something that is specific to their disability or what their medical needs are. What are their interests in the community? And as Kathy talked about earlier, not everybody is going to have not only the same interest in the community, but may not want to be as integrated. They may be a little bit more of an introvert. So, understanding that integration really comes from the individual, and maybe one individual's activities in the community are not as frequent or as in-depth as what another individual's interests may be. So having those conversations, using those person-centered planning tools to help paint the picture of what that looks like for each individual. Discussing efforts that were not successful in the past, Maybe you have an individual that you've tried helping facilitate some of those community connections, and some of that hasn't worked in the past. So, you know, what were those efforts? What did they look like? Why do you think they were not as successful for that individual? And brainstorm some other approaches with them. Don't just stop at, you know, if one strategy didn't work, don't just stop there. You know, there's always other approaches or other ways to help facilitate that integration. And again, I know you've heard this a lot, and you'll see it a lot through your person-centered planning tools, but can't reiterate enough the importance of balancing what's important to an individual and what's important for them. I haven't seen any other questions come through, but we definitely want to take a minute to pause and wrap up and see if there are any other questions that you guys have at this time. All right. The last thing we want to highlight is our next steps. So thank you all for participating today. We do have one other webinar coming up on June 12th. This is, again, just kind of wrapping up all of the information and the compliance process with the HCBS settings rule. So that's scheduled for June 12th from 9 to noon Central Time. We have included the training registration link. So if you don't mind going ahead and registering for that webinar ahead of time. Jamie has also posted an exit survey in the chat box. Please take that exit survey, give us any feedback, any additional information. Maybe you need additional information or things that weren't covered or could have been better covered as part of this webinar. We would definitely appreciate the feedback moving forward. Jennifer or Betty, do you have anything else?
Yes, I just sent an email to the whole group about a person-centered thinking training that's upcoming through the Mississippi Person-Centered Initiative through USM. So there's a training upcoming in June. But they're also taking requests for additional trainings in the different communities across the state. So I'm sure their time is limited, but if you could reach out to them directly and let them know your training needs, if you have some person-centered thinking training needs, that would be a good way to address those.
All right. Thank you all for attending. We would definitely appreciate, again, your feedback on the exit survey, and we look forward to talking to you again in June.